All right, so we are recording, Rachel.
Hooray, hooray. I always love it when the tech works because I'm always a little bit surprised.
Yeah, me too. Let's be
Um,
honest. Anytime I'm involved and a computer actually fully functions, it's kind of a life-changing event.
uh, yeah, kind of. Um,
All right, so
yeah.
folks, obviously we are live and recording, and welcome to the Resilient Adult Podcast. A place where right now we're making it up as we go along. This is our season zero, our unanticipated season zero. Welcome to the COVID-19 quarantine edition of our podcast.
Yes.
And today we are going to talk about a very simple question that um, basically a lot of people don't know how to cook. And they don't know how to cook because no one ever taught them how to cook. And so today's episode is all about why did we not learn how to cook?
Well, and how to feed ourselves when, it's really a time period where it's becoming really obvious for a lot of people that their life revolved around a quick fast food bite or ordering salads from Freshie or whatever, and now they can't. And suddenly life has gotten a lot harder than it really should be. Um, I was telling Marissa before, when I did my, weekly brave the disease so that we can have groceries run, the grocery stores here in the Chicagoland area can be a little picked over, particularly the pre-made packaged foods. Um, and what got us started about talking about this topic was a woman that I saw. And please understand that I am in no way trying to make fun of this woman. She was clearly more put together than I was. She was dressed well, she was wearing nice, on brand, expensive clothing, and she was also having a small, private, emotional meltdown in the frozen foods aisle because there were no frozen vegetarian dinners, very few choices for frozen vegetables, and no veggie burgers. And in a fit of what was truly, viscerally, just deep seated frustration, she exclaimed out loud, "Why are there no veggie burgers? What is a vegetarian that doesn't know how to cook supposed to eat?" And I got to thinking because I had stopped at the store, actually, literally swerved off the road into the parking lot because I saw through the window that they were stocking fresh produce and I was really excited about it. That there was lots of vegetarian friendly food, but if you don't know how to take whole zucchinis and giant mushroom caps and turn them into dinner, that's not useful to you.
No, I mean, it might as well just be cardboard, honestly, at that point, if you don't know what to do with it, or even that you can do something with it.
Um, we have a joke in my family actually based on some video that someone else made that we came across on the internet, and I would love to give credit, but I really have no idea where the phrase came from. But it's a person standing at a like a farm stand holding a strange looking vegetable, and the response is, "What is this and how do I cook it?" Um, and I think that's kind of what we're talking about here is that yes, there is food available, but if you don't know how to turn ingredients into dinner, it doesn't help you.
No, and especially like right now, where, I mean, even people who do know how to cook are suddenly discovering how exhausting it is because it's not just the physical cooking, it's that they're used to cooking one meal a day, maybe a couple times a week, and then eating out pretty much otherwise or buying all pre prepared stuff. And now it's suddenly turned into cooking three meals a day every day, and then also having to plan and buy for cooking three meals a day every day.
And the dishes. Oh my
And
God,
the
the dishes.
Yeah, so I mean the whole domestic load right now has just, I mean, essentially in a weird way what we've done is we've reverted back to our grandparents' time and their reality, except we no longer have a domestic specialist in our home for most of us. Um I consider myself pretty fortunate. I was not specifically taught these skills so much as a kid I was just super curious about food, and I grew up with a mom and a grandma who both were really amazing cooks. And so I learned quite a bit about cooking from them. But when I say amazing cooks, I don't mean that they were pastry chefs or that they knew all sorts of recipes. I grew up in a very working class household that came from essentially my parents grew up in poverty. They grew up in rural poverty. I grew up in working class that sometimes became impoverished because yay Reaganomics in the 1980s and factory workers not being able to find jobs for months on end. So yes, at some points we in fact had government cheese in my household. But the thing is my mom could take
Oh,
government
I
cheese and
actually love
make
government cheese.
the
I wish
world's
people
best
would sell
food.
it. Like, I think you have to have grown up eating it, but if you grew up eating government American cheese, there is a special place in your heart for it. It makes the best macaroni and cheese on the planet, and I
It's
would
perfect.
happily
It
cook it
melts so
for people.
perfectly.
It does, but it doesn't get that weird plastic like Velveeta. I don't know. I love that stuff. My grandparents did a lot of my child care when I was young. I came from a single parent household. Um, and they were on a fixed income. And yeah, I grew up eating government cheese and powdered milk and the giant, like, white Crisco tubs of peanut butter, and those were the foods of my childhood. Apparently, that there's a very small subset of our population at our age that knows what King Vitamin cereal is. Um,
That's not actually what I'm familiar with, but I am super familiar with. I had the parents who they didn't want me to feel bad in front of my friends, so they used to buy the bagged cereal that came in like the plastic bag, but then they would put it in the Kellogg's boxes in the cabinet, and
oh my
I
god!
literally didn't know that Frosted Flakes didn't taste like crap till I was like in my early 20s and bought a box myself.
So true story. My grandmother didn't do it with food, but I was the generation of you had to have Guess jeans or Jordache jeans, and my family couldn't afford either of those labels. But we were at a Goodwill or some sort of thrift shop and found a pair of Guess jeans, and they were destroyed. They weren't wearable, and they were also like nowhere near my size. But my grandmother sewed. So she sewed that little Guess triangle on the pocket of every pair of cheap Kmart or Walmart jeans I owned for 5 or 6 years.
That's amazing.
Hey, it worked. Nobody questioned it.
So getting into this, talking about like I actually did a little bit of research because I myself was like, when you told me this story, I was like, how is it that somebody who is clearly well educated, clearly comes from a good family, exactly how is it that they could end up just not having learned how to cook? Because don't we have home ec class? Because like when I was a kid, at least when I was in junior high, we all had to take this class, home ec, and home economics, full name. And we were taught, I mean, not great cooking skills, but like how to chop things without cutting yourself, how to, boil water, make pasta, make a couple very simple recipes. And so I was like, hey, like, how could that happen that you could grow up and literally not know like how to make pasta with sauce or something?
They don't have home ec classes in a lot of schools anymore. Um, they've gotten rid of home ec. They've gotten rid of industrial arts. They've gotten rid of all of those how do I care for myself and my own personal things type classes. Like when
And
I
did you
was
know there's
a kid,
actually an economic reason why?
is there really?
Yeah, there really is. So here's the thing, it goes back to my personal quote unquote favorite president, Ronald Reagan. You know,
Oh yeah,
best
love
guy
him.
ever. Like I
We'll
talked
get
about, he's
into
the
that
reason my
circle.
parents were unemployed for the vast majority of my childhood. But also, no, he's actually personally responsible for this. So he actually signed a bill into law, and it was not like super important. There was no big signing ceremony. Nobody really talked about it super much or anything else. But it's called the Carl D. Perkins Vocational and Technical Education Act. It was
Oh,
signed
that's
in
where the Perkins loan
1984.
comes from, right?
Yeah, it's the same act that establishes the Perkins loan, which allows people to take out federal student loans for technical education programs, which is actually really amazing and awesome.
Yeah,
Like,
that
I'm
part.
not in any way dissing that part of this program, but it was super consequential, and part of the reason is that it establishes all of the funding, all of the federal funding for public and private high school education programs for technical education. And the thing is that most public schools, because these classes are not requirements to graduate, there's no real funding for them from the states. So they only have their local funds and then this bucket of federal funds that's available. But to get that money, what this law did is change the rules about it. And now those programs have to establish that they lead to training to jobs. It must be jobs, by the way, not just life skills, but jobs in fields that are both of these things. They have to be both in high demand and high paying.
Ah, so it was if it's not something we can turn into high income, it's clearly not valuable.
So what does this do? It means childcare classes are out because childcare is in high demand, not high paying. It means anything that's meant to help you in your personal life is out because it doesn't lead to a job directly. It even shop class eventually came under fire because the salaries for carpenters went down, especially in the early 90s when that recession that happened around 91, 92 really pushed a lot of um, more highly educated immigrants into the construction industry, which really brought a lot of the wages down. And so what you've seen is just more and more of these classes disappearing. It's not actually a judgment on the part of schools. People think it has to do with, oh, we don't have time, blah, 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 standardized tests. It's actually all about economics. It's because our government says economically these are not valuable and we're not paying for them.
Yeah, that sounds pretty par for the course, actually. It's actually tied to a lot of things that if you look at it, we have stopped learning the skills that are not necessarily easily monetizable.
Oh,
And
yeah.
this was a mistake.
Come on, Sam, pay attention to me. I'm bored.
Because welcome to beta testing, guys. Well, because it turns out that for all the jokes on the internet about the value of the work of a housewife, we kind of didn't value it until now nobody knows how to do it. Or
Well, and there's actually a reason we don't value it too there, and it's not just straight up sexism, although that seriously does play a huge role in it. Um, we literally have no mechanism to value it because economics forgot to figure that out. So the foundational treatise of economics, if you were, most people are aware of a guy called Adam Smith. If you've not heard of Adam Smith's name, you've definitely heard of the name of the paper slash novella he wrote in the 1700s, which really, I mean, it's basically the foundation of economics. It also was a hugely influential document upon the founding fathers of America. And most people are aware of the phrase it contained in it, the invisible hand of the market. He also coined the term the free market in that same paper.
oh, I remember him vaguely from a history
Yeah.
He's the
So
guy
the
that
whole
like
point of
if it's not a, you're going to say this better than me. Something about something is worth what people are willing to pay for it. Is that him?
yeah, I mean basically that is him. He definitely said that in there. And the whole paper is organized around explaining how economies worked, which actually was really brilliant. He was kind of a proto blogger in his way with this paper because he took a very impersonal, huge systemic process, the economy, and he boils it down to something anybody could understand, which is where does your dinner come from? Right? And so he talks about um basically that like the way that capitalism works specifically is that essentially it doesn't come down to the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that you can expect your dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. That's his exact words, by the way. Basically saying is the baker produces the bread not because you personally would like to have bread with your dinner, but because lots of yous would like to personally have bread with their dinner.
And we are willing
And
to give the baker money for it.
and we're willing to give the baker money for it. And the same thing with the butcher and the brewer, etc. But what Adam Smith never talks about, and actually there's a brilliant book that just came out a few years ago that covers this exactly, is he talks about all this, but what he doesn't include is the final step, which is after you go to the brewer and you get your beer, and after you go to the butcher and you get your meat, and after you go to the baker and you get your bread, who brings that home and makes dinner out of it? Well, in Adam Smith's case, it was his mother, because he never married and he never had enough money to hire a cook. So
And
his mother
things
cooked for
happened
him.
his entire life. He never had to think about it. It
He
just
never had to think about it. It never occurred to him. He didn't even include it at all in his story. It's just invisible. He doesn't say you can't value it. He just didn't even think about it to value it. And that's where the sexism comes into play. And then we fast forward 250 years and we get to when we're establishing a concept you may have heard of called GDP. If you've ever watched CNBC or listened to a politician speak, you've probably heard the phrase GDP. GDP, gross domestic product. What that means, it's the sum of everything that was bought and sold in our entire economy in a specific period of time. So every transaction that takes place. But what does that mean? That means that it does not measure anything that doesn't have a monetary value. That there's no transaction that takes place, no transfer of funds.
Which eliminates any kind of bartered commodity where, okay, I will make you this blanket and you'll watch my kids for the afternoon kind of things. But it also gets rid of any sort of in-home domestic labor unless you're paying a maid or a nanny.
Exactly. And so, and actually when they were coming up with GDP, this was during the Depression, they were trying to find a way to measure how can we tell if the economy is getting better or not, right? We want a measurement. We want a quantitative measurement that we can make that will tell us, is what we're doing working or not, which was great. That was a great impulse, that FDR and his cabinet had. We need a way of telling if what we're doing is working or not, right?
Well,
Yay.
It was a tool to do a job.
Yes.
That is not the job that we need to have done right now.
Well, and also the guy who came up with it actually specifically said, like, this is meant to look at the paid economy. It should not be used to measure whether or not the country is doing the right things or doing well. It's specifically just measuring paid employment. Is it getting better or worse?
Well, and at a time when unemployment ran anywhere from 23 to 50%, just, hey,
Yeah.
are people having jobs again was information they wanted to measure.
And they didn't have the ability at that time with their information gathering abilities. They didn't have the ability to actually get a real jobs report. So what they could do is they could look at sales taxes, which told them about everything that was bought and sold, which gave them really quick information about whether or not employment was increasing or decreasing, right? Because if people are buying a thing, that's going to create a job somewhere. And so that was the original concept of the GDP. It was a tool specifically to help the country during a time when we didn't have computers and large-scale information gathering, to help them measure the economy and figure out if what they were doing was working. And then what we've done is we've turned it into the be-all, end-all measurement of whether or not our country is doing the right thing in basically every field. Because the United States is not just a capitalist country. It's almost embraced capitalism and specifically free market economics as something akin to a national religion. And we've sort of,
faith.
yeah, it's sort of replaced that void in our national culture a little bit, especially on the federal government level. And the problem with that is that, economics just ignores this huge whole part of the economy. The care economy is what it's usually referred to by those economists who actually study it. There's not many of them, I have to be honest about. And the whole economy of our country and most industrialized developed nations is completely underpinned by unpaid labor. The unpaid labor of caring, whether that's caring for ourselves or caring for children, caring for, our
elderly parents or the infirm. Like, it's all underpinned on this because our economy does not do those things. That's what we're discovering in this crisis right now, is that we've ad hoc kind of filled some of those voids with these things like, Uber and Handy and all of these like little app-based things. But it was only a Band-Aid to begin with, but now we've ripped the Band-Aid off.
Well, and I mean, now we're in a situation where we really can't outsource right now.
No, not at all.
And I mean, there has been hints that people are sort of realizing this, because there's a huge preponderance in the last couple of years of like the Blue Apron or something kangaroo, or there's a bunch of like, I will send you a box of ingredients and you will put them together and it will be food, which is kind of home ec in a box, for lack of a better term. But the problem is that a lot of people are not starting at lightly saute. They're starting at, there's raw meat in front of me, now what?
Can I touch it?
Can I touch it?
Do
How
I
do I clean it? Is this safe? And again, those are also services that are really reserved for people that are relatively wealthy. If you somehow didn't gain these skills and you don't have that kind of money, then that's still not a resource for you. So to kind of draw ourselves back to dinner, because man, do we love a tangent. We were going to talk a little bit just about basic cooking for regular everyday people who just want to eat dinner. And we're going to keep this pretty close to the COVID edition in terms of, hey, every recipe we're going to put out there is highly adaptable. Every recipe we're going to throw out there is something that is really hard to mess up. I feel like cooking shows, for all of their popularity, have really made basic cooking harder on a lot of people, because I could make beef Wellington in an hour too if somebody came in and pre-measured all of my ingredients and pre-marinated my meat and brought me my beautifully made puff pastry, and then I got the magic one that comes out instantly when I put the one that I made on camera in the oven. I totally want the magic dinner, but nobody's going to come to my house and give it to me. So there are some very basic staples that you need to make a kitchen work. Because I've talked to people that are like, well, I'd like to learn to cook, but I can't afford all the things you need. Like, all right.
Yeah. You really don't need much. I can tell you, I've lived
a frying pan, a knife, a whisk, and a spatula. I can cook everything I know how to cook with those utensils.
And you don't need a fancy kitchen. I've lived in some pretty crappy apartments and fairly substandard older housing in my life. I've been able to cook meals both every day and extremely fancy. You've been present for some of them.
Oh, you threw quite a dinner party.
and the thing is, you just need a counter space, realistically. Like a area, like one piece of counter, like that would fit over a bottom cabinet, and that could be a folding table. It doesn't even need to be an actual counter.
You know, when my daughter was little and I was teaching her to cook, I used to actually put out disposable tablecloths when we would cook on the floor, because there wasn't room in my tiny little kitchen to meaningfully figure out a way to have something for her to stand on at the counter. It worked okay. You have to keep your floor clean. Which is, a good impetus to mop more often. But yeah, I do want to say, full disclosure, I am fully cognizant that there are people out there for whom food security is a real issue, that will hear something like this and be like, well, great, but I don't have a place to store those kinds of ingredients, or I don't have a stove whose oven is safe to use. And well, that is a very real and definite problem that needs to be addressed. That is not the problem we are addressing tonight. And in a lot of what we're going to talk about as this podcast goes on is, what are we actually trying to fix? Because it turns out society is not terrible at fixing problems. It's terrible at figuring out what problems it's actually addressing. A lot of times we're not doing what we think we're doing.
Yeah, that's super accurate. Basically, I would say that this podcast is focusing on the problems of, I would say, basically working class to upper middle class people who grew up and didn't get an education and basic life skills, and also those people who simultaneously want to make sure they don't do the same thing to their own kids.
Right. None of these little quickie tips or tricks are necessarily going to, or not necessarily, are definitely not going to pull someone out of abject poverty. It's
No.
that is not something that all of the can-do attitude and flexibility in the world is going to magically fix, and we do understand that.
I'm a financial coach. There are sometimes people ask me for help, and I look at what they've got going on, and I basically say, you know what, I can't help you. You need to go talk to a bankruptcy attorney about your options.
Right. I mean, there are just, I hate that idea of, pull on the bootstraps and magically fix this, because when we are talking about skills deficits, we are specifically talking about skills deficits. We are not talking about massive financial inequalities or major illnesses or things that very much get in the way of these same issues, but for very different reasons. If you're not cooking because you have a degenerative muscle disorder and you can no longer stand at the stove, then my rice and beans recipe is not going to fix that for you.
No, it is definitely not going to fix it.
If you are someone who is like, all right, I bought some beans, now what? Then this is for you.
So going into it, rice and beans man. So first off, I just want to mention to our listeners that all of these recipes, actual follow directions recipes, are going to be posted on our social media. So you can definitely look these up at any time. And we're not actually going to go through every single step. This is more of a general, vague, how do you make it, how do you approach this sort of system.
And by all means, if you have a dietary restriction, substitute. These are all very, very forgiving recipes. If my rice and beans recipe can become vegan by removing butter and adding some vegetable-based fat. I don't know what we can do with the frittata. There are eggs. I don't think there are vegan eggs.
Yeah, I don't know that a frittata, I mean, I think possibly you could use soft tofu, but honestly, it wouldn't be a frittata.
No, because it wouldn't hold together. My point, though, is that one of the first things to learn about real cooking as opposed to television show cooking is that it's probably fine. There are a couple of basic staple ingredients that every kitchen needs. And I would say, and you can kind of jump in here with the things that you think. Everybody needs salt and pepper. I would do a seasoned salt that you like. I would do Italian seasonings. You'd be amazed how many cuisines actually use those 4 herbs. It's usually basil, rosemary, oregano, and thyme, and you can put that in just about anything. And then I would say sugar, cinnamon, probably vanilla, and
that's
garlic.
Reasonable. Definitely garlic.
Definitely
I literally, garlic. Except for dessert, every food is better with garlic.
Yeah, I would also say soy sauce is a great resource because it really allows you to take a really cheap cut of meat and make it tender. Vinegar will do the same thing, but vinegar is a very strong flavor. Soy sauce will mostly read it as salt. By the way, if you use soy sauce, don't add salt or it won't be edible.
So why don't you just get right into the rice and beans recipe really quick? Just walk us through, how do you cook a pot of rice? How do you cook the beans?
So basically, if you are using any kind of traditional medium grain to long grain rice, unless the packaging says otherwise, it's usually a 1-to-1 ratio. So it's a cup of water per cup of rice, and you can adjust that how you want, down to about half a cup. More than that, and you have problems with the bottom of your pan scorching. And then you need a pan with a lid. You take your rice, and rinse it under the faucet. Then you dump it in a pan, add the equivalent amount of water, throw in a pinch of salt if that's where you are. Put the lid on, or turn it up onto medium heat. When it starts to bubble, turn it way down, put the lid on, and leave it alone. The secret to rice is to not touch it. The more you stir it, the more likely you are to get glue. That's how they make the gooey part of congee, is you stir the rice. That's how they make the gooey part of risotto too. It's just stand and stir forever. But if you don't want that gluey bit, then you can't stir your rice. After about 20 minutes, take the lid off, stir it around. If it's soupy, cook it some more with the lid off. If it's starting to dry out, throw a little more water in, put your lid back on. Rice is a really forgiving food. People have been eating it for thousands of years. It's something you can cook over a campfire. And while your rice is cooking, for the beans, the secret ingredient in my recipes is not love, it's butter. I cook with a lot of butter. I don't personally care for olive oil, but you can totally use olive oil for this. You can use coconut oil. Put about a tablespoon of some sort of fat in the bottom of a saucepan. Chop up about half an onion and some garlic. If you're using jarred garlic, I'd add about a tablespoon and a half. If you're doing fresh garlic, I'd add about 3 cloves. If you're doing garlic powder, shake it until the little blob of butter looks like it's been snowed on with garlic, and that'll be about what you're looking for. I don't use garlic powder. My mom does, but I prefer fresh, and I have the ability to do that, so I do.
Yeah.
Turn on your burner. When the butter melts and the garlic and the onions start to change color and smell good, toss in some of what you would consider taco seasoning. Now, whether that's you buy the big jar that says taco seasoning in the spice aisle at the grocery store, or you buy the little packet that's some brand name homemade taco, or if you look at the recipe online, I've got a homemade taco seasoning that I tend to throw together for that. Toss it in with your onions and your garlic and your fat. Stir it around a little bit. As the herbs heat, you will smell them too. When you start to smell them, turn your heat down, and then you open 2 cans of beans. Which beans? The ones that you can find, because the shelves are totally picked over right now.
Also, in the recipe, there's going to be an addition of this for dealing with dried beans, which are...
Oh, you got to soak your beans.
There's some work you've got to do ahead of time.
Yes, I'll go back and talk about dried beans, but for now, this is the recipe that I kind of threw together in my head with the woman in the grocery store in mind, so I'm keeping it as simple as possible. That day, my grocery store happened to have pinto beans and kidney beans, so those were the 2 that I used. So you open the cans, you drain about half the liquid out, you dump them in the pan, you stir. You take your favorite hot sauce, unless you hate hot sauce. If you hate hot sauce, you leave this part out. You shake some in. I would say 3 to 5 shakes for a medium amount of spice, but if you're not sure, err on the side of less. You can add more, way easier than you can take it out. There are tricks for removing salt and spice from foods, but they require you to have other ingredients. When your rice is done, let it sit, take the lid off, fluff it up with a fork for a little bit. Let your beans simmer. Combine them together. You can add cheese, you can add sour cream, you can add cilantro, you can add whatever you have around the house, but this is inexpensive. It's nutritious. All of the ingredients are shelf stable. I don't know if people know this, but butter is totally shelf stable. I know we store it on the fridge in the US, but we don't have to.
Salted butter is totally shelf stable. If you buy unsalted butter that does need to be refrigerated, it's the salt that actually keeps the beasties at bay.
True, but even unsalted butter will go rancid, which means it smells bad and it tastes bad, but it will not make you sick.
That is true.
Which, we don't want dinner that smells bad and tastes bad, but if you're in a situation where it's a problem, it's worth knowing.
That is very true.
So yeah, the nice thing about this is it's completely shelf stable, which means it's pretty good for anybody. We used to make this when we went camping. It's very forgiving. You can add more of any of the spices later on in the cooking. Eat your beans over your rice. There you go.
And so here I'm going to throw in another recipe that actually goes great with rice and beans. And so this is a recipe of how to cook meat, not a specific meat. This literally can be used for any cut of meat of any animal. Now, I wouldn't use this for a fancy cut of meat. This is a cooking method that is designed to take cheaper cuts of meat and make them taste absolutely fabulous. And really, its secret ingredient is time. So as long as you have time, you can make the best meat. And what's great about this is that it makes a really tender, flaky kind of meat, which is great for putting in something like rice and beans.
Well, and I want to be clear, when you say time, you don't necessarily mean time in the kitchen.
No, I just mean time to let it cook where you're close enough by that you can just let it cook in the background, which is also what's great. A crock pot allows you to do that and not be home. I wouldn't do this on a stove when I'm not home because of safety. I have a gas stove that's an open flame. That's just, I feel, a bad idea.
Never leave the house with open fire, particularly because you have pets.
Yeah, exactly. But so basically what you want to do is you take your cut of meat. Some really common ones I like to use are pork shoulder. Pork shoulder has the downside of being a huge piece of meat. It's usually between 10 to 15 pounds because it's literally the shoulder of a pig. Pigs are large animals. But what's great about pork shoulder is it's one of the cheapest cuts of meat you can buy in most grocery stores because most people don't know what to do with it. It's just too big and they're not really sure what to do with it. Another great one, you can do a whole chicken this way, or you can do any piece of a chicken you can get from wings, which I don't really recommend just because there's better ways of cooking wings, but you could. You could do drumsticks, you could do thighs, you could do whatever. You could have bone in, bone out, does not matter, literally and truly. I wouldn't do ground meat. This is not a good recipe. This is a whole cut of meat recipe.
Cook differently, and your best bet with that is unless you're making some kind of meatloaf, just saute it up on the stove.
Yeah, honestly. So take your cut of meat. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take a pan that is large enough for that entire cut of meat to fit in, and the sides of it go above the cut of meat. So if it's a big pork shoulder, I will literally use a soup pot that I make sure has no plastic on it anywhere, or glass. It's all metal. You can, if it's a smaller cut of meat, you can use, obviously a smaller pan, but you want something that has a lid, that the sides of it reach above the sides of the cut of meat when it's inside of it. And that there's a little bit of room around it, not too much. Right. And so what you want to do is you get some oil. Literally, you could use olive oil, butter, lard. You could cut some fat off of the piece of meat and drop it in the pan and render it out. I mean, it does not matter. You just need a little bit of fat, about roughly 2 tablespoons worth for a big cut of meat, down to maybe a teaspoon for a tiny cut of meat. What you're going to do is you're going to make that liquid, that fat. So it's liquid, it's a little bit bubbly. You don't want it overly hot. And then that is basically the point at which I take my cut of meat and I dredge it through some flour, which just means literally put flour in a bowl, roll the cut of meat around until all of it's covered in a little bit of flour. And if you are gluten sensitive, which is a real thing, I know it gets blown up, but there are people who really are gluten sensitive. The flour's purpose is it helps it brown a little bit more, and it also will help to thicken the juices up a little bit. If you, for some reason, can't have flour, you can use any gluten-free substitute, or you can go without it. It does not matter. It just makes a little bit better finish on the dish.
Really great for this.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. So then what you're going to do is you're going to sit in that oil. You're going to sit the meat that's now covered in flour on there, and you're just going to brown each side. And this is the great thing. If you move it and it's not yet brown, you can just put it back till it turns brown. The more you leave it alone, let it sit there, the more brown you're going to get. You don't want it to burn, but you want it to be pretty brown. Till every single inch of the outside of it is completely browned. However many times you have to turn it depending on the cut. All right, and then you put it, you leave it in the pot, and then what you're going to add to the pot is you're going to take your meat out of the pot, put it on a plate. You're going to add to the pot an onion that is chopped up however size of onion you want to eat in your mouth. You can dice it, you can just slice it, you could put a half an onion in there. It's kind of a personal preference matter. And you're just going to cook that till it sort of starts to turn translucent. It really looks kind of clearish. You can't literally see through it, but it's more clear than white.
So if you're looking at cookbooks, this is called sweating an onion.
Yes. And it
Or
releases a lot of water, is what
are
you're going to
great
see.
if you know what those words mean. So if you come
Yeah.
across sweat your onions, that's what's happening there.
Yeah. And then you're going to add all the dry spices you want to add. I personally, my favorite ones to add to this sort of thing is a little bit of salt, a little black pepper, garlic powder. I do like garlic powder for this purpose. Sometimes I'll put in onion powder if the onion didn't seem real strong or if I only had like half an onion or whatever. And then I like to add some herbs. I have a herb mix I bought at like Trader Joe's a long time ago, but thyme works great in this. Tarragon, you could use oregano, basil, like any of those kind of green herby spices. Whatever your personal preference of what you like is, add a couple tablespoons of them down into those onions, stir it around so you can really smell it, just like Rachel talked with the rice and beans. Then put your meat back in the pot. Now you want to add some sort of cooking liquid. Now, my personal preference for taste is very cheap dry red wine, about half a bottle, and then just enough broth of some kind to get it to the top of the meat. You do not need the red wine. I like it personally. You could use any kind of vaguely acidic liquid, so you could add a couple of tablespoons of vinegar to some broth would also equally work. And what you're doing is you're creating a liquid that's going to break down tough parts of that meat.
The acid actually tenderizes the meat as you go.
Yeah, exactly. And then you put the lid on it, you stick it in your oven, and you turn the oven on to 300 degrees, and then you proceed to ignore it for 5 to 7 hours. If you're doing this in a crock pot, you might want to do it the night before, let it cook till dinner time, because crock pots cook at a little bit lower of a temperature. And that's essentially it. That's the whole recipe. And at the end of it, you're going to have a piece of meat that is literally going to fall apart when you try to move it. And you're going to have the most amazing, rich cooking liquid that makes the best gravy you've ever had in your life if you add a little bit of cornstarch and milk to it.
Oh, yeah. Pan gravy is a beautiful thing.
And that's basically it. That's the recipe. And that goes great with rice and beans. It also is great on its own. It's also amazing on pasta. You can slice it. If you don't cook it quite so long, you can slice it and put it on bread. It's just kind of like, it takes any kind of meat and just makes it brilliant.
Well, and it's so flexible at that point.
Yeah. So like you go to the store, maybe the meat section is picked over, which is what happened to me a couple weeks ago because I'm in finance, but I'm in healthcare finance. So my job is still quite ongoing and not considered shut down right now. Because people are still, we still have to buy supplies, etc., as you may have heard about. It's actually more work than anything right now.
Oh, I hear you. People, man, talking on the internet about teaching from home. And I will say that it is nice that I don't have to worry about putting shoes on because I hate them. But, it is hard enough to get middle schoolers to pay attention when you are in the room with them. They don't tell you that all the teacher tricks don't work online.
Yeah, I mean, so we're kind of inventing this now, and so I didn't get around to doing my big panic shop until pretty much the stores were completely picked over, and so I went to my local grocery store, which is actually a Jewel Osco, Albertsons for the rest of the country, and I went to the meat section and I was like, okay, well, there's still pork shoulders aplenty because nobody ever knows how to cook those, and so I bought pork shoulders, I bought oxtails. I bought. I
have so much pork because my local grocery store caters to a predominantly Jewish population. So
same thing. So it's like what was left, right?
Right. I can't buy beef to save my life, but man, if you want pork, I can get the pork.
So it's like the great thing about this is that literally whatever you panic bought in that shop that you're now like, what do I do with this? As long as it's not been ground up, this will make it delicious.
Yeah, well, and I mean, ground beef, you add all the same, or ground meat, you add all the same spices. You just do it on the stovetop and saute it up.
Exactly.
So recipe number 3. This is probably the easiest of all of them. It is certainly the fastest. It is what I like to refer to as I have made vegetables. Now what? Um, because I do not have a great eye for how many or how much of a given vegetable my family is going to eat. Some nights I make sauteed mushrooms and they're gone and people are asking for extras. And some nights I make sauteed mushrooms and I look at the serving bowl and like it doesn't look like anybody ate anything. So they get tossed in a Tupperware and they get tossed in the fridge. And for a long time, a week later, they got tossed in the trash. Because
I hate that.
I hate that. But in my head, I've like meal planned for the week and I have all of my ingredients. And so I was, if I didn't remember to bring them to lunch, because sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, which the nice thing about working on the couch is that if you forgot your lunch, you can go back to the kitchen. I will give it that. But the nice thing is, it's like, okay, so you take Sundays sauteed mushrooms and Monday nights zucchini and some broccoli that's in the freezer that's starting to look freezer burned that you want to cook. And, you know, that red pepper is getting a little wrinkly and probably ought to have something done with it. So you chop that up and you saute it up a little bit. And all right, cool. I have my random selection of vegetables. If you've done Marissa's meat preparation and you take it and you fork separate it and you put it in a bunch of little tiny Tupperwares or Ziploc bags so that you've got a small amount for a lot of things, which I totally do, you can toss that in too. So in an oven-safe frying pan, and I lucked out because I inherited all of my grandmother's and great-grandmother's cast iron, which no wonder women were described as small but mighty, because I have a 5-gallon Dutch oven that weighs as much as a kindergartner. Man, it is amazing, and you cannot kill this thing. I have buried it in campfires. But you take your frying pan that goes in the oven, anything that's stainless steel, anything that's ceramic.
Just it cannot have plastic. That is the key, guys. No plastic.
Can't be that weird non-stick Teflon coating, because that's basically plastic.
Yeah, that's true.
But in your frying pan, you stick it on your stove. You throw in a small amount. We're talking just enough to make the bottom of the pan shiny, of some sort of fat or oil. This can be tallow, it can be lard, it can be butter, it can be coconut oil. It doesn't matter. You just don't want your stuff to stick. Into this, you will throw some garlic. It can be fresh, it can be jarred, it can be powder, it doesn't matter. And then you will throw your vegetables. Warm them up, spread them out a little bit. Toss your meat in there if you're going to have meat. I tend to like to fry up like 2 strips of bacon and mix it in, because bacon is an excellent flavoring agent.
True facts.
And then you take some eggs. An 8-inch frying pan will take 3. A 10-inch will take 4. A 12 will take 5 or 6. And if you've got this nice 5-gallon Dutch oven, you can put a dozen eggs in there if you're feeding a lot of people.
Now, just to clarify something for people who literally do not know anything about cooking, when she's talking about inches on this pan is a circle. She's saying if you took a tape measure and you measured from one side to the other, how many inches across that is.
Exactly.
Just to be clear.
Make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So you crack the eggs in a bowl with a fork or a whisk. You mix it around till the yolks are broken and everything is mixed together. Throw in some dried spices. Mine is straightforward. I use seasoned salt and Italian seasoning, pretty much always. Pour this mixture over your veggies. If you want cheese, throw in some cheese. It can be chunks of cheese. It can be shredded cheese. I like to use blobs of ricotta because I think that blobs of ricotta are delicious and I put them in as many foods as I can. And then you take your pan and you put it in the oven. Turn the oven on to 350 degrees. And I set my timer for 20 minutes because my grandmother assured me that frittatas are done in 20 minutes. And they never are. They're done in about 25. But basically, at the 20-minute mark, just to be sure, maybe your oven's more efficient than mine, grab the handle of your frying pan. Please use a heating pad. I know this seems self-explanatory, but if I say do step by step what I say, I middle schoolers, man. You gotta put
That is very true.
if you can shake it gently, like this is not a maraca at a luau. You don't play maracas at luau's. I don't know. Guys, I gotta leave my house soon. Anyway, shake the handle of the pan. If you don't have any liquid egg jiggling, it's done. Take it out, put it on top of the stove, ignore it for 5 minutes. And then you cut it up like pie. It's kind of like a lazy quiche where you don't have to go to the effort to make pie dough.
Which I never want to go through the effort to make pie dough. I have to be honest, pie dough, I love to cook. I even like fancy cooking. I buy pre-made pie dough every time.
You know, I make a fabulous pie dough, but it has to be something that I've committed a day to.
Anybody who ever said easy as pie has never actually made pie dough. That's all I have to say about that.
Eat pie, because that's actually pretty easy. I love pie. But there are a bunch of recipes out there that were created to use up leftovers.
Yeah. I mean, that's like a cultural thing. And we're going to have some more of these recipes on our social media, obviously. But basically, these 3 things are a great way to take the same ingredients and sort of do them 3 different ways. 2 of them can be made fairly vegetarian. Obviously, roasting meat is not, but you can actually do the same thing, by the way, with tofu.
I don't like it with tofu, but you can also do it with jackfruit.
You can also do it with jackfruit. You can make a mean barbecue pulled pork out of jackfruit. So all these things are very versatile. We have a couple more recipes in there, sort of what I call refrigerator soup, which is sort of like minestrone, but minestrone done for multiple cultural ways. Also have 2 are competing mac and cheese recipes, which we'd love to hear if people try these, which one they like better, because that is definitely a little bit of a source of competition between us right now.
Yeah. I will say Melissa's mac and cheese is delicious. Don't get me wrong.
But you just like yours better. I get it. So I do want you guys to check it out. Go ahead. We're out on Facebook. We're out on Instagram. Please go ahead and check that out. We'd love to hear from you about it. And just remember, like, basically the whole gist of this is we didn't learn how to cook because economic and social and cultural trends convinced our grandparents and parents not to teach us, and we never learned. And you can't hold yourself responsible for not knowing something because you never learned. But we can always decide to.
In this world that I don't know how to do. It's staggering. It's impossible to know how to do everything. So if you are a person who didn't learn to cook at their grandmother's knee, as a lot of people didn't, then go and experiment and accept that at least once you are going to make something and take 3 bites of it and order pizza. Just give yourself permission for that to happen and then go have fun. And as a trick, if you take 2 spice bottles and you hold them together and you smell the insides and it doesn't smell good to you, don't put both those spices in your food.
No.
Because most of our sense of taste is actually our sense of smell. So, you know, I come from a French background. I don't like tarragon. It's sort of a sore spot with certain family members. But yeah, there's not a wrong way to do a lot of this.
So we hope you go out, you try some stuff, you explore. Cooking is kind of fundamental because we have to eat something every day. So it's a really important skill, and we hope we were able to help you guys a little bit. Good luck with your quarantine and keeping sane. And we're going to be back next week with another episode, which is going to be about something we haven't decided yet because, like we said, this was not planned. So welcome to season 0.
I think that's my new battle cry. I'm just going to randomly shout it during my online classes, too. What do you think?
I think that sounds great, Rachel.
All right, guys. Happy cooking.
Happy cooking. Bye.
Bye.